My life had always been ordinary. I wasn't particularly ambitious, nor did I think much about the future beyond paying my rent and making sure I had enough left over to fill my gas tank. At 31, I worked for a demolition company in Ashbourne, a small town barely big enough to show up on most maps. We specialized in clearing out damaged buildings, places destroyed by storms, neglect, or most often fires. It was grueling, dirty work, but it paid the bills and kept my hands busy. On a Monday morning in late October, I was assigned to clear out the remains of an old mansion on the outskirts of town. The place had gone up in flames the week before, leaving little more than a charred skeleton of what must have once been a grand home. Word around town was that the owner had died in the fire, a reclusive older man named Walter Dreyfus. Dreyfus was a name people in Ashbourne knew well. He'd come from old money, inherited most of it decades ago, but his family's fortune had dwindled over the years. People said he'd spent his final days alone, surrounded by piles of antiques and memories of a family that no longer cared about him. It felt strange, walking through the burned-out remains of someone's life. Most of the furniture was reduced to ash, the walls blackened and crumbling. My job was to assess the structural integrity of what was left and mark anything of value that could be salvaged. I didn't expect to find much. Most fires this severe left nothing worth keeping. But then in the basement, I found something that changed everything. The basement was damp and smelled of smoke and mildew. The fire hadn't reached as far down, though water damage from the firefighters had left the floor slick and the walls peeling. I was poking around a corner, trying to decide if the stone foundation was stable enough to leave standing, when my boot hit something metal. Looking down, I saw a small, rusted latch sticking out of the floor. Curious, I knelt and brushed away the soot and debris, revealing what appeared to be a trapdoor. It was heavy, reinforced with metal edges and bolts, and the latch was secured with an old padlock. I glanced around, making sure no one else from the crew was nearby, and then I pulled out my multi-tool. It took a few minutes of effort, but the lock eventually gave way with a satisfying snap. The trapdoor creaked as I pulled it open, revealing a narrow set of stone steps leading down into an even darker, mustier space. At the bottom, there was a single metal box about the size of a briefcase sitting on the floor. The box was heavy when I picked it up, its surface cool and smooth despite the humid air. It had no lock, just a simple latch that popped open with a push of my thumb. Inside, I found a stack of old documents, neatly folded and tied with string, along with a set of keys. The papers were yellowed with age, but surprisingly well-preserved, and as I flipped through them, I realized they were deeds, legal documents tied to properties I'd never heard of. But what really caught my eye were the stock certificates. There were at least a dozen of them, issued by a company called WD Enterprises. The name was unfamiliar, but the bold, printed numbers in the value column made my pulse quicken. Finally, at the bottom of the box, there was a small envelope sealed with wax. The initials WD were pressed into the seal. I didn't open the envelope right away. My hands were shaking as I shoved everything back into the box and carried it out to my truck, making sure no one saw me. I didn't know what I'd found exactly, but I knew enough to understand it was valuable. That night, sitting at my kitchen table under the dim light of a single bulb, I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, scrawled in elegant cursive. To whoever finds this, it began. If you are reading this, it means I am gone. These documents represent what remains of my family's legacy. A legacy I have done my best to preserve, though not without sacrifice. The properties listed here are yours to claim, should you choose to take on the responsibility. The keys included will grant you access to a safety deposit box in Ashbourne Bank, where you will find further instructions. Use what you find wisely. The letter was signed Walter Dreyfus. I stared at the letter for what felt like hours, my mind racing. The implications of what I'd found were staggering. If the deeds and stocks were real, and if I could claim them, this box could be worth a fortune. But why would someone like Dreyfus leave all of this behind for a stranger to find? The next morning, I called in sick to work and went straight to Ashbourne Bank. The keys in the box fit perfectly into the safety deposit lock, and inside, I found another set of documents, more detailed information about the properties, bank statements, and a few personal letters written by Dreyfus himself. According to the records, the properties included a block of apartment buildings in a nearby city, a handful of rental homes, and a plot of commercial land that was being leased to a chain of restaurants. The stock certificates, meanwhile, represented shares in a company that had been defunct for decades, but their value had somehow remained intact. It was overwhelming, like I'd stumbled into someone else's life. I spent the rest of the day researching, poring over every detail I could find. By the end of it, one thing was clear. If everything was legitimate, I was holding the keys to a multi-million-dollar fortune. But the questions wouldn't stop nagging at me. Why had Dreyfus hidden this? Why hadn't he passed it on to someone in his family? And what would happen if they found out I'd claimed it? I didn't have the answers. But one thing was certain. My life would never be the same. The first few days after finding the box were a blur. I kept the documents hidden under my bed, pulling them out late at night to go through them over and over again. Each time, I found something new, a detail about one of the properties, a note scribbled in the margins of the deeds, or a financial record that hinted at just how much wealth was tied to Walter Dreyfus' name. The more I uncovered, the more uneasy I felt. This wasn't just money, it was a legacy, a fortune that had somehow gone unclaimed, hidden away in the ashes of a man's life. But there was no guidebook for a situation like this. I didn't know what to do next, or even if what I was doing was legal. What if Dreyfus had distant relatives who could come forward and challenge my claim? What if the documents weren't legitimate? Part of me wanted to walk away, to leave the box at the bank, and pretend I'd never found it. But the other part, the part that remembered the years of working dead-end jobs, of going to bed hungry, of being invisible to the world, couldn't let it go. I started with the properties. There were 6 in total, for apartment buildings in Ashland, a mid-sized city about an hour away, a commercial plot leased to a chain restaurant, and a large rental house on the edge of town. The deeds were clear. Walter Dreyfus had owned them outright. But his death had left their status in limbo, and without a will or direct heir, the properties were essentially frozen. The only thing linking me to them was the letter he'd left behind. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get me started. The first step was tracking down the tenants in the apartment buildings. I spent days driving to Ashland, knocking on doors, and introducing myself as the new representative of the Dreyfus estate. Most of the tenants were polite but skeptical, and a few were openly hostile. "You're the landlord now?" one woman asked, her arms crossed as she leaned against the doorframe. "Where the hell have you been for the last 6 months?" "The elevator's been broken since March. I'm working on getting everything sorted," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She rolled her eyes, but let me inside to inspect the unit. The truth was I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't have the money to pay for repairs, let alone cover the property taxes that were piling up on all 6 locations. But I couldn't let that stop me. The next few weeks were a crash course in property management. I spent hours reading books, watching online tutorials, and calling contractors to get estimates for repairs. I didn't have the funds to pay them up front, but I used the bank account Dreyfus had left behind to cover the basics. Slowly, the building started to turn around. I fixed the elevators, patched the leaky roofs, and cleaned up the common areas. The tenants were still wary of me, but some of them began to soften as they saw the changes. At the same time, I started looking into the commercial plot. The restaurant leasing the land was part of a national chain, and their payments were steady and reliable. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me afloat while I worked on the apartments. The rental house was trickier. It had been sitting vacant for years, and the interior was in bad shape. Cracked walls, water damage, and a mold problem that would cost a fortune to fix. I considered selling it, but something about the place felt important, like it was a piece of the puzzle I hadn't figured out yet. Through it all, I kept the stock certificates tucked away in the back of my closet. I didn't know what to do with them, and the idea of cashing them felt like crossing a line I wasn't ready for. But one night, as I was going through the documents for the 100th time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the corner of one of the certificates, written in tiny, almost invisible handwriting, were the words, "See the journal." My heart skipped a beat. What journal? I tore through the rest of the box, searching for anything that matched the note. Finally, at the bottom of the stack, I found a small leather-bound notebook. The cover was cracked and worn, and the pages inside were filled with Walter Dreyfus looping cursive. The journal was a mix of personal reflections and business notes. Dreyfus wrote about his family's decline, his regrets about how he'd handled his fortune, and his fears that his legacy would die with him. But buried among the entries were references to something bigger, a deal he'd been working on before his death. "I can't let them take it," he wrote in one passage. "The stocks are the key, but the real value is in the properties. If I can secure the lease with the city, everything will turn around. The family name will mean something again." I didn't understand all of it, but the mention of a city lease caught my attention. Flipping through the pages, I found a map Dreyfus had drawn, marking a plot of land near the center of Ashland. I didn't recognize it at first, but then I realized it was the commercial plot tied to the restaurant. What was so important about that land? The next morning, I drove to the address on the map. The restaurant was still there, its parking lot full of cars, but something about the layout caught my eye. Behind the restaurant was a fenced-off area with a no trespassing sign. It looked like an abandoned construction site, overgrown with weeds and littered with old equipment. Curious, I parked my car and walked around the perimeter, searching for clues. That's when I saw it. A small metal marker buried in the dirt, stamped with the words, "Property of the Dreyfus family." My pulse quickened. What had Walter been planning for this land? And why had it been left untouched for so long? I didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about uncovering a legacy that had been buried for years and figuring out what to do with it before someone else got there first. The discovery of the marker behind the restaurant stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. Walter Dreyfus had been meticulous, leaving clues in his journal, but I still couldn't piece together what he had planned for the land. Why would someone like him, drowning in debts and isolation, care so much about a plot of dirt hidden behind a parking lot? I spent the next week diving deeper into the papers he'd left behind, trying to connect the dots. Late at night, in my cramped apartment, I pored over old deeds, financial statements, and entries from his journal. But the answers were elusive. One thing was clear, though. The properties Walter owned were valuable, and the documents in the suitcase weren't just evidence of his wealth. They were a roadmap. A roadmap to something bigger, something he hadn't been able to finish before his death. The first crack in the puzzle came from an unexpected place. I was sitting in a coffee shop near one of the apartment buildings when a man in a suit approached me. He was tall and sharp-eyed, his expression calm but calculating. "Mr. Gray?" he asked, his voice low but firm. I frowned, nodding. "Yeah, that's me." "Who's asking?" He slid a card across the table, the name Simon Hayes printed in elegant script. Below were the words, "Legal Counsel for the Dreyfus Family Trust." I felt my stomach drop. "I've been looking into the assets associated with Walter Dreyfus' estate," Hayes continued, taking a seat without waiting for an invitation. "And it seems your name has been coming up quite a bit." I forced myself to stay calm. "I'm not sure what you mean." Hayes smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "I mean the properties, Mr. Gray. The deeds, the accounts, the stocks. You've been making moves, and I want to know why." His words sent a cold wave of fear through me. How much did he know? "I found some documents," I said carefully. "I've been trying to sort through them, but I don't know much about what they mean." Hayes studied me for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "Let me be clear, Mr. Gray. The Dreyfus family has a vested interest in these assets. If you've claimed them under false pretenses, I suggest you reconsider. Quickly." He stood straightening his tie. "I'll be in touch." And just like that, he was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Hayes' words echoed in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stepped into something much bigger than I realized. The Dreyfus family hadn't shown any interest in Walter's life when he was alive, but now, suddenly, they cared. The idea of losing everything terrified me, but so did the thought of giving it all up. I'd worked too hard, come too far, to walk away now. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. The next morning, I drove back to the lot behind the restaurant. This time I brought tools, a shovel, gloves, and a crowbar. If Walter had gone to the trouble of marking this land, there had to be something here. The fenced-off area was quiet, the weeds rustling in the wind as I started digging near the metal marker. The dirt was packed hard, and my arms ached with every swing of the shovel, but I didn't stop. After nearly an hour, I hit something solid. Dropping to my knees, I cleared away the dirt with my hands, revealing the corner of a wooden crate. It was heavy and reinforced with metal bands, the wood splintered but intact. Using the crowbar, I pried the crate open, and my breath caught at what was inside. Stacks of blueprints, rolled up and tied with string. Old maps, annotated in Walter's handwriting. And at the very bottom, a thick folder labeled Dreyfus Development Proposal. I brought the folder back to my apartment and opened it with shaking hands. Inside were detailed plans for a massive redevelopment project. Walter had been planning to transform the land behind the restaurant into a commercial hub, retail spaces, offices, and even a community center. The project was ambitious, far beyond anything I'd imagined. But it wasn't just about profit. Walter's notes spoke about creating something meaningful, something that would restore the Dreyfus name while benefiting the community. This is my chance to leave something behind. One note read, "A legacy that matters." As I read, I felt a strange mix of admiration and frustration. Walter had poured his heart into these plans, but he'd never been able to bring them to life. Now, by some twist of fate, they were in my hands. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. I started meeting with contractors, city officials, and anyone else who could help me understand the scope of the project. Most of them were skeptical. Who was this nobody trying to revive a dead man's dream? But as I showed them the plans, their attitudes began to shift. Walter had been ahead of his time. His designs were innovative, and the location was perfect for development. With the right funding and support, the project could work. But there was one problem: money. Even with the properties I owned and the stock certificates, I didn't have enough to fund a project of this scale. I needed investors, and convincing them wasn't going to be easy. One night, as I sat in my apartment surrounded by blueprints and financial projections, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Claire, one of the tenants in the Ashland apartments. She'd been helping me manage the buildings, offering advice and support when I felt overwhelmed. The message was simple: "You're on the right track. Don't give up." I stared at the screen for a long time, her words sinking in. Claire didn't know the full story. No one did, but her encouragement gave me the push I needed. The next morning, I made a decision. If Walter had seen this project as his chance to leave a legacy, then I would make it mine too. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I wasn't going to let fear stop me. It was time to take the biggest risk of my life. Pushing forward with Walter Dreyfus redevelopment project was the biggest gamble I'd ever taken. Everything I owned or claimed to own was now tied to these plans. If it failed, I'd lose everything: the properties, the money, and the fragile stability I'd built for myself. The first step was securing investors. I spent weeks pitching Walter's vision to anyone who would listen. Business owners, real estate developers, local politicians. I approached them all, armed with blueprints, financial projections, and Walter's detailed notes. Most of them dismissed me outright. Too ambitious, they said. Too risky. Others just laughed, saying no one would invest in a redevelopment project based on decades-old plans from a man who had been reclusive and broke. But there were a few who saw the potential. One of them was Mark Holden, a prominent developer who owned several office buildings in Ashland. He was skeptical at first, but after reviewing the plans, his interest grew. "You've got something here," he said during one of our meetings. "This isn't just another strip mall. This could actually revitalize the area." "That's the idea," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. Mark agreed to invest, on the condition that I match his funding. It was a steep ask, but I knew it was my best shot. The next challenge was liquidating what I could. The properties were bringing in steady income, but I needed more upfront cash to meet Mark's terms. Selling one of the apartment buildings felt like a betrayal of Walter's vision, but I convinced myself it was necessary. The sale went through quickly, and with the funds in hand, I was finally able to move forward. Construction began on the lot behind the restaurant, and for the first time, Walter's dream started to take shape. The overgrown weeds were replaced with freshly paved streets and neatly laid foundations. Where there had once been nothing but dirt and rusted equipment, buildings began to rise, modern, clean, and full of potential. Seeing the progress was exhilarating, but it also came with its share of headaches. Every week, it seemed like a new problem arose. Contractors falling behind schedule, unexpected zoning issues, budget overruns. It felt like the universe was testing me at every turn. But the hardest part was dealing with the Dreyfus family. Simon Hayes, the lawyer who had confronted me weeks earlier, wasn't going away. He started showing up at the construction site unannounced, asking pointed questions and making veiled threats about lawsuits. "You're walking a fine line, Mr. Gray," he said during one particularly tense encounter. "The family isn't happy about how you've been handling their assets. As far as I know, Walter didn't leave a will." I shot back, keeping my tone calm despite the anger bubbling inside me. "Legally, these properties are unclaimed. I'm just trying to make something out of them instead of letting them rot." Hayes smirked, his expression cold. "We'll see how long that argument holds up in court." His words rattled me more than I cared to admit. I didn't have the resources to fight a prolonged legal battle, and the thought of losing everything after coming this far was almost unbearable. The pressure only increased when local media caught wind of the project. At first, the coverage was positive, stories about how the redevelopment could bring jobs and opportunities to the area. But as the Dreyfus family's objections became public, the narrative shifted. "Are you the rightful heir to these properties?" one reporter asked during a press conference. "I'm working to honor Walter Dreyfus' legacy," I said, dodging the question. Another reporter pressed further. "Do you have the legal right to claim these assets? Or is this just a grab for wealth?" The questions felt like daggers, each one chipping away at the fragile foundation I'd built. Through it all, Claire was my anchor. She had become deeply involved in the project, handling logistics and helping me navigate the endless bureaucratic red tape. "You're doing the right thing," she told me one night as we sat in the office, surrounded by stacks of paperwork. "Walter wanted this to happen. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." Her belief in me kept me going, even when everything felt like it was falling apart. One evening, as construction neared its final stages, I found myself alone at the site. The buildings were almost complete, their windows reflecting the setting sun. It was the first time I'd allowed myself to really look at what we'd built. I thought about Walter, about the man I'd never met, but whose life had become so deeply entwined with mine. In some ways, it felt like I was finishing something he'd started decades ago, bringing his dream to life in a way he never could. But as proud as I felt, there was still a weight hanging over me, a sense that the fight wasn't over. That feeling proved true a few days later when Simon Hayes returned, this time with a group of people in tow. "These are members of the Dreyfus family," he announced, gesturing to the well-dressed men and women standing behind him. "They're here to reclaim what's rightfully theirs." My stomach dropped as one of them stepped forward, a middle-aged man with a stern expression. "I don't know who you think you are," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But this project doesn't belong to you. It belongs to our family." I held my ground, meeting his glare. "Walter left these plans behind. He wanted this to happen. None of you cared about him when he was alive. So why do you care now?" The man's face darkened. "Because you're profiting off of his name, and we won't let that stand." Hayes smirked, clearly enjoying the confrontation. "You've built something impressive, Mr. Gray," he said. "But don't forget, it can all be taken away." That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the journal Walter had left behind. The weight of everything was crushing, and for the first time, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. Was I fighting a losing battle? Was it even worth it? I flipped through the journal, searching for something, anything, that could reassure me. And then I found it. On one of the final pages, Walter had written a single sentence that stopped me in my tracks. "Legacies aren't given. They're built." The words hit me like a lightning bolt. Walter hadn't just been talking about his family or his fortune. He'd been talking about me. About anyone who dared to take what life gave them and turn it into something meaningful. With renewed determination, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let the Dreyfus family take this from me. Not without a fight. If they wanted to challenge me, they'd have to face someone who had spent his entire life fighting for survival. The final battle for Walter Dreyfus' legacy ended in a courtroom, but it wasn't the victory that stayed with me. It was what came after. When the judge ruled in my favor, I felt a mix of relief and disbelief. The Dreyfus family's attempts to claim the properties and the redevelopment project had failed, and for the first time in months, I could breathe again. The verdict didn't bring celebration, though. Instead, it left me thinking about how fragile this journey had been. A few wrong steps, a slight miscalculation, and everything I'd built could have crumbled. But standing in that courtroom, I realized that it hadn't just been Walter's legacy on trial. It had been mine too. The project was completed 6 months later. What had once been a barren, forgotten lot had transformed into a vibrant commercial plaza, complete with shops, offices, and a community center. The area buzzed with life, a testament to Walter's vision and the hard work it took to make it real. At the grand opening, I stood on a small stage in the plaza, addressing a crowd of tenants, business owners, and community members. This project started with a dream, I said, my voice steady despite the nerves threatening to choke me. Walter Dreyfus wanted to create something that would outlive him, something that would give back to the community. Today, we honor that dream. The applause that followed was loud and heartfelt. But what meant the most to me was the sight of Claire smiling in the crowd, and the quiet nod Pete gave me from the back row. That evening, after the festivities had ended, Claire and I walked through the plaza, now lit by warm streetlights. The shops were glowing, people were milling about, and the community center stood as a beacon of hope. Claire slipped her hand into mine. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," I corrected, giving her a grateful smile. She stopped walking, turning to face me. "Do you think Walter would be proud?" I looked up at the center, the culmination of his dream, and thought of the words he'd written in his journal. Legacies aren't given. They're built. "I think so," I said, my voice quiet but certain. He wanted this to be about more than just him. And now, it's about everyone who gets to be a part of it. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't just surviving. I was living. Walter's legacy had become my own, but it wasn't about the money or the buildings. It was about creating something that mattered. And for that, I would always be grateful.